They thought Pam Bondi's golden retriever was just there for comfort, until he stood up in the middle of court, walked to the witness stand, and triggered a confession that stopped everything. Cold Murphy didn't bark, he didn't growl, he didn't even twitch an ear when Pam Bondi quietly tapped her heel against the wooden courtroom floor twice, but he moved without hesitation. The golden retriever rose from his relaxed posture beside the defense table, his leash still loosely draped from Bondi's hand slid. Off without resistance, he walked calmly, too calmly, across the courtroom, weaving between rows of chairs, until he reached the witness stand. Then, without a sound, he sat right in front of Malcolm Behrens, the prosecution's star witness. No one said a word. Judge Gregory Watkins was mid-sentence, but the second Murphy sat down and locked eyes with Behrens, the judge's mouth hung slightly open, stuck in silence. The court reporter's fingers slowed. Even the bailiff, who'd been standing near the back wall with his arms folded, leaned forward slightly. Yes, narrowing. Behrens stiffened. His throat bobbed. He looked down at the mahout, then back up at Pam. Bandichet didn't move. She just looked at him and waited. "What is this?" the prosecutor whispered to his assistant, but no one answered. Behrens shifted in his seat, then again, his hands, which had been resting calmly on the Bible, not 2 minutes earlier, were suddenly gripping the edges of the witness box. "I need a minute," he muttered, barely audible. Judge Watkins frowned. "You're under oath, Mr. Behrens, if you're feeling unwell." "The court can," but Behrens cut him off. "I wasn't supposed to say anything, but I was pushed to change the timeline. I didn't want to. It wasn't my idea." Dead silence. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. The gallery erupted in gasps. A juror looked around, unsure whether to stay seated or react. The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Behrens, sorry, you saying your sworn statement was falsified?" Behrens couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Partially yes, it was like someone had taken a hammer to the trial. Everything cracked, every assumption, every plan, every carefully prepared point fell to pieces in an instant. Pam sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Murphy turned his head slowly and walked back to her, settling again. At her feet, she stroked his back once. No words, no gesture beyond that. The room was still in freefall. Judge Watkins blinked hard and leaned back in his chair, collecting his thoughts. "We're taking a recess, effective immediately. Bailiff, clear the courtroom. Counsel." To sidebar, Murphy licked his paw. The court emptied in slow motion. Phones were already out. Reporters whispered feverishly, and no one, not a soul, had an explanation that made any sense, because on the surface it looked like a woman gave a secret signal to her dog, and that dog exposed a lie that could change the entire outcome of the trial. Was Murphy trained to detect deception? Had Bondi set this up, knowing the pressure would crack the witness, or was it just an impossibly strange coincidence? No one could say for certain, but something had shifted in that courtroom, and it wasn't going back to normal anytime soon. But before any of that made sense, people started asking the one question no one expected to matter. How did Pam Bondi end up here in the first place? 2 days earlier, the parking lot behind the Duval County Courthouse in Jacksonville, Florida, was already packed before 8 a.m. The press vans were out early, their satellite dishes raised like antennas on a bug inside in courtroom 4B. Things were quiet for the moment. Pam Bondi walked through the rear security entrance, holding Murphy's leash loosely in one hand, her briefcase in the other. Her expression was tight, focused as always, but anyone paying close attention would have noticed something. Else she didn't look like someone preparing for a typical day in court. She looked like someone waiting for a window to crack open. "Morning, Miss Bondi," said Officer Tran as she checked her badge. "Hey." "Tran," Pam replied, giving a nod. "Murphy's got his ID badge." The officer chuckled as he leaned down to pat Murphy gently on the head. "Best behaved dog we've ever had in here." Pam gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Murphy didn't wag his tail. Stood calmly beside her, focused like he was already listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear in courtroom 4B. The air was different. You know when you walk into a room and everyone's already made up their mind about you. That's what it felt like, though. Pam's client, Dominic Rincelli, sat waiting at the defense table, pressed suit, anxious eye, tapping one foot like it was a metronome. Dominic had been a regional development director at Cora Trusta, private investment firm based out of Tampath. Fraud allegations against him weren't small, nearly 12 million in manipulated asset evaluations. But the weird part, Dominic hadn't tried to flee, hadn't deleted a single file, hadn't even loitered up until a week after the story hit local news. "Did you sleep?" Pam asked as she took her seat next to him. "Does 3 hours count?" "It does today." Dominic leaned in, his voice a whisper. "I keep thinking if I go down, who's